Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak again. I'll really be talking about low-carbohydrate diets and how I changed my understanding that you should be eating from high carbohydrates to low carbohydrates. So it's a bit of about mea culpa, I was wrong and I apologize, but actually if you look at the evidence, I'll try to explain why it looked so obvious that you have to eat carbohydrates. So if you went back to the literature in 1939, I wonder if someone could find a pointer for me at some stage. It seems to have disappeared. Steve stole it.
That's my personal.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Steve. So here's a study in 1939 in which a group were put on a low-carbohydrate diet or a high-carbohydrate diet, and what you observe is on the low-carbohydrate diet they're burning mainly fat, but they could only last for 60 minutes, by which time their blood glucose had fallen. So if you read that paper in 1939, you'd assume that a high-carbohydrate diet was absolutely critical for your performance. And the same guys did the next experiment, that they took people until they stopped exercising. At this point, they were exhausted. They were given 200 grams of glucose, and you can see blood glucose rose, and these people were able to continue. And this person's oxygen consumption actually rose up, showing that they actually increased the exercise capacity. So when we got involved in this carbohydrate story, we went and looked for the great scientists who'd done this work. And so we would quote, like David Dill was one of the great scientists of all time, and he said the ingestion of a heavy carbohydrate meal a few hours before the marathon race and a supply of glucose before and during the race are logical. So we thought, my gosh, we've discovered this. This is these great scientists saying we must eat lots of carbohydrate. And the first conference I ever went to was in New York City, and it was the New York Academy of Sciences. And the leading authority on glucose metabolism during exercise was a chap called Warren. And he presented these data, and he showed that if you exercise for a long time, for 240 minutes, your blood glucose concentration will tend to fall. And he said the reason is because your muscles, at rest, the muscles take up less glucose than the liver is producing. But during exercise, the rate of glucose uptake increases, and it increases further, but the rate of glucose released by the liver goes up and then goes down. So at this point, the blood glucose must fall because you're producing less glucose than the muscles are taking up. So therefore, we all knew now carbohydrates are clearly critically important. What's really interesting at this conference in 1977, no one mentioned fluids during exercise at all. We didn't think that you needed to take fluids during exercise. It took a long time before the modern scientists could come and show that you needed carbohydrate during exercise. And Ed Coyle did this publication in 1986. He took a group and he fasted them for 12 hours before the experiment. And then he had the one group take 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour for 3 hours. And that was that group. So they ate 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour for 4 hours. This group had a placebo, and you'll notice that they stopped early. And their carbohydrate oxidation goes down, and their muscle glycogen use is pretty much the same. And this group, even though their glycogens are equally low, they're able to exercise for longer, suggesting that it was the blood glucose that was slowing them down. And so this was the final evidence we all needed to say that you must take a lot of carbohydrate before you exercise, so that you stuff your muscles with glycogen, and you must take lots of carbohydrate during exercise. And that is the predominant model that we are still teaching at people. If you go to the Ironman triathlon, you will see that athletes are taking 100 grams an hour during the marathon, and probably during the cycle as well, 100 grams an hour. And it comes from this type of study. At the time, I was working with one of our great runners, a chap called Bruce Fordyce, who won the Comrades Marathon 9 times, and we're going to talk about him a bit later. And he said it's not possible for me to run a long-distance race without ingesting a high-carbohydrate drink, especially for the last few hours of the race. And together, we developed the first goo in the world, and it was called Fordyce, Rose, and Noakes, FRN. So we produced that product that is currently widely used. The Scandinavians, meantime, just before, had developed the muscle biopsy technique, where they would put a biopsy needle in the muscle and take out a bit of muscle and measure its glycogen content. And they said, you see here, if you are on a high carbohydrate diet, you start with much more glycogen in the muscle, and you can burn it and you go on for longer. Whereas if you lead the low-carbohydrate diet of the kind that we're promoting, you start with less glycogen in the muscle and you get tired very quickly. And your blood glucose drops as well, and your respiratory quotient would be low, so you're burning fat. So what did we conclude? We concluded that if you're burning fat, you can't burn it fast enough to keep you going. And that was the conclusion. And then we had this classic paper, which took a group who were on the low-carbohydrate diet, which is a 5%, the Finney diet, and look how badly they did. They couldn't last at all, whereas the group eating the high-carbohydrate diet lasted for much longer. So you can understand why in the 1980s it was very difficult to get up and say, you must eat fat. We have to say carbohydrates because we had all the evidence. And we did a bucket of research. We did 10 years or 15 years of research, and we did some of these studies, and here's a typical one, where we measured glycogen use during exercise in people who are carbohydrate loaded, or they were not carbohydrate loaded. And you can see again that with carbohydrate loading, you start with much more glycogen and you last for longer. And we noticed there were a couple of guys who stopped early, and as predicted, they had low glycogen, which was exactly what we expected. So this proved the model. If you did add too little glycogen in your muscles, you would stop. And so if in the 1970s you'd read the literature, it said depletion of the endogenous carbohydrate stores has been shown to be a limiting factor in the ability to perform long-term exercise. And that is a conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, which you cannot draw. You cannot draw that conclusion because that's association, and association does not prove causation. They're two events happening at the same time. They do not prove causation. But if you went even further, a little bit later, in 1987, Conley reviewed the literature, and he said when muscle glycogen runs out, the muscle fails from lack of ATP production. However plausible and attractive theory is, it's unproven, and that's correct. And then he says what is clear is that in glycogen-depleted muscle, ATP is being used up faster than it can be manufactured, and so force output is diminished. Now that is a bad conclusion. It's completely wrong. Because if you run out of ATP, what happens? The muscle goes into rigor and cannot move. So if ATP is being used up faster than it can be manufactured, muscle rigor must occur, causing death and the termination of exercise. And the fact that you laughed indicates you watched a lot of races, and that's never happened. So that model doesn't work at all. So you see what the model was, it's this, that you have a certain ATP requirement during exercise, and we know that your muscle glycogen use must go down because you must ultimately run out of glycogen. So the argument would be that you run along and you burn more and more fat until you reach your maximum fat oxidation rate. And when you reach that maximum rate, you have to develop an ATP deficit. So if you continue to run at that speed, the outcome must be rigor. That's the only outcome. And so we know that doesn't happen, so clearly we don't understand what the reality is. But what does happen is that you might reduce your exercise intensity, and then your ATP production rate will be fine. And this is exactly what happens, or the way the body is designed. The body is designed because we have a brain to make sure that we don't damage ourselves during exercise. And so what would happen if this was real? You would slow down if you reached a maximum rate of fat oxidation. You would actually slow down. And so this model would explain why you get tired and you don't get into rigor. So it's important to remember that the brain regulates exercise performance. And that's part of my other research, to absolutely show that the brain will always be getting information back from the muscles, and if they were at risk of running out of ATP, you would just slow down. They'd tell the brain, stop. So, as a result of all this research, of 20 years of our own research, and this is now continued because who's the main funder of exercise research? People who make carbohydrate products. So 99% of the researchers in the field are dependent for funding on the carbohydrate industry, okay? As I was when we were doing the research. So when we draw, this is a diagram I drew up maybe 10 years ago, And what it shows is the whole focus of getting glucose to the muscle to produce energy. So we make you eat and drink lots of carbohydrate. We stuff the muscle, the liver with glycogen. We stuff the muscles with glycogen. And then even the muscles that you aren't using, for example, the arms can produce lactate, and that can produce energy. And we think we really got it all right because this is how you exercise. And the elephant in the room goes missing. So what's the elephant in the room? The elephant in the room is that. Can you see that this is a diagram I drew up 10 years ago? Where's the focus? It's all on carbohydrate, but the carbohydrate stores are limited, but you've got so much fat in the muscle or in the body, and we just ignored it, as if it doesn't exist. Can you believe the brainwashing that we had gone through to do that? So we just ignored this as if it wasn't important. And then, as Steve mentioned, he came along and changed our minds, but he was influenced also by Stefansson. And Stefansson, as I showed you, wrote these 3 books. And then it was Steve who did the first study, and here is his study. And what he showed was that if you adapted people to this high-fat diet, their performance wasn't worse. So 4 weeks of adaptation to the ketogenic diet resulted in no change in endurance performance. And when you look at the data, and he gave us some of this data today, you'll notice there were 2 big responders and there were 3 non-responders. So 3 people, their performance went down, and 2, there was a huge improvement in performance. And so the question might be, if he'd had 5 of those people, he would have drawn one conclusion. If he'd 5 of those people, he would have drawn the opposite conclusion. So clearly there was an effect, and maybe it wasn't present in everyone. And we were, in fact, the very first lab to be inspired by Steve to go and do our own studies. And as he showed you earlier, this was one of our early studies in which we adapted people to high-fat diets, and we made them exercise for 150 minutes on the first day of adaptation and on the 10th day of adaptation. And this is their fat oxidation grams per minute. And you can see that within 10 days, they'd increased their fat oxidation rate. Nothing fantastic, but just to indicate to you that the body, as he showed, has a huge capacity to increase its fat oxidation. And we then did some experiments, which I'm embarrassed to show you, because what we found was that when we gave people high-fat diets, they performed unbelievably well. Look at this. Performance 79 minutes on the high-fat diet and 42 minutes on the high-carbohydrate diet. And we published it, and it got accepted for publication, but that's bogus. I mean, there's no way you could get this change in performance. I don't believe it. I don't know what we did. But I promise you we didn't actively cheat, but there must have been something. We must have influenced the guys that we really thought the high-fat diet was good and important, so they chose to perform better on the day. And then we did another experiment, 20K time trial, and on the high-fat diet, they also went faster. They went significantly faster on the high-fat diet. So here we had a second study showing a benefit. And again, was it true? I don't know. But the point I'm making is we now produce 2 studies which show the high-fat diet actually was beneficial. So on the balance of evidence, the scientists should all have said, gee, we've got to stop eating carbs, we must eat high-fat. But that didn't happen. And so then we did this study, which everyone remembers. Everyone remembers this study. And the sports industry, which promotes carbohydrates, promotes this study, ignores the other 2, because what did we find? We had people do a 100K time trial after they'd been on a 6-day high-fat diet. And again, of course, that's far too short to get an adaptation, but it's really difficult to do these experiments. And so what we found was that the endurance performance got worse. It actually took them longer on the high-fat diet than on the high-carbohydrate diet. And it was marginally different, but what really, the stuff that people loved, the high-carbohydrate people loved, was we measured the power output. So we made these people do sprints during the event. And so they did 4-kilometer sprints, which are down here, and then they did 1-kilometer sprints up here. So they did 1, 2, 3, 4 4-kilometer sprints interspersed in the 100Ks. And there was no difference in performance there, but maybe it was slightly down here. But in the 1K sprints, you'll notice on the high fat diet, their performance dropped off for the second, the third, and the fourth sprint. But surprisingly, by the fifth sprint, it came back again, which was interesting. But now this is now given as conclusive evidence that a high-fat diet impairs your performance and doesn't allow you to do high-performance exercise. But this is called pacing. This is a pacing strategy. And the fact that they come back to the normal there tells you that they could have done it here, but they chose not to. So there's a motivational component to this, which we didn't correct for or didn't understand. But so that's the state of art at the moment, that if you are involved in a 100K time trial, you wouldn't want to put the people on a high-fat diet for 6 days because it would impair performance. So while all this was happening, I met this lady, Paula Newby-Fraser, and she spoke to me in the 1980s. She'd just come to America. She won her first Ironman, and she asked me, she said, "Tim, I've read about these high-fat diets. What do you think I should do?" And I supposedly told her that I think it's a very good idea that you eat a high-fat diet. And I don't remember saying it, but in anything she writes, she says, the most important thing in my whole career was being told by Tim Noakes to eat a high-fat diet. And what happened? She won 28 Ironman triathlons, and she was named the triathlete of the millennium. And she's followed a low-carbohydrate, and she's still, at 50, she looks amazing, and her performance, her athletic performance is astonishing for a 50-year-old. So the greatest triathlete of all time has been on a high-fat diet, and she will easily tell you that. What about Mark Allen, who was her male equivalent, and who also won 6 Ironmen, and for 14 years totally dominated the sport? He said, I didn't do well on a high-carb diet. It seemed like it was too low in protein, and I personally need a little more fat than Pritikin. Pritikin was a very low-fat diet, was saying, and so I didn't really tell people how I ate because it was contrary to what was popular in the 80s. He was too scared to say what he was actually eating. Today, I think people won't tell you because they know they've got an advantage. So they won't tell you the truth. So for me, the 40% fat, 30 carbohydrate, 30 protein was the ideal diet. Now, the interesting thing about Mark Allen was that in his greatest race, he ran a 2:39 marathon at the finish. So he swam for 40 minutes, cycled for 4.5 hours, and then he ran a 2:39 marathon in midday heat in Hawaii. And so I tried to work out, well, how could you possibly run that speed when I know from my own experiments that 4.5 hours cycling completely depletes your glycogen in your muscles. So he had to start this race glycogen depleted, and yet he could run a 2:39. So we made some calculations, and these are in Law of Running. And we said, if you want to run a 3-hour 30 marathon, you have to produce 58 kilojoules per minute. Where would it come from? Come from glucose, lactate, and fat. And these are the maximum rates that we could calculate would be present in a person who's already run exercise for 4.5 hours. So if we were to run a 3.5-hour marathon, he must be burning 0.76 grams of fat per minute. To run a 3-hour marathon, it must now become 0.91 grams. And if it was to run the marathon in 2 hours 40, he'd have to be burning about 1.2 grams per minute. And we had never, ever measured such high values in the laboratory, but we'd never studied fat-adapted athletes. And so the prediction from this model was very simple, that he would have to be burning fat at about 50% higher if he wanted to run that 50 minutes faster. So to run 50 minutes faster, he had to burn fat 50% faster than if he was running slower. And Jeff Volek has recently, and I think we heard about this from Steve just a few minutes ago. Jeff Volek has recently shown that fat-adapted elite ultramarathon runners can oxidize fat at exactly that value that we calculated he would need to. And they've also shown that these guys can burn 1.7 grams per minute. So what that tells us is that if you're fully fat-adapted, you can run really fast. And if you can run a 2:40 marathon or faster, which is astonishing. And it means that people who are running 4 or 5 hours in marathons, the fat adaptation would probably be more than they need. But the reality is there must be an exercise duration for which fat adaptation is the preferred state for optimal performance. And I don't know that we found it yet, but what I've tried to show you is that fat adaptation is enough to allow you to run really fast in events, much faster than most people are able to do. So, I then, with Jeff and Steve, who's these two fabulous books, you will have heard about them, we wrote a review recently, an editorial, and we found that this was the finding. There have been 11 studies of high-fat diets, of which we've done about 4, I think, and Steve have done a couple, and there are only a few other laboratories in the whole world who've ever done them, so there's 11 studies total. And 3 showed a significant positive effect, and I've shown you 2 of them which I'm very dubious about, so please understand that. 4 showed a non-significant effect favoring the low-carbohydrate group, 2 no effect, and a further 2 showing a clearly negative outcome. So, and I think there's a real concern about the placebo effect, because you know if you're eating the high-fat diet. And if you believe the high-fat diet will make you perform better, you will perform better. And so I don't know how we ever control for the placebo. But what my point is that even on these inadequate studies, they certainly don't suggest that a high-fat diet's a problem. And that so therefore there must be some value to them. And we made the final point, as there are no studies of the effects of low-carbohydrate diets on the ease of weight control. And that's what people tell you. It's so easy for me to control my weight. Capacity to train and the ability to recover from training. The South African's world champion in the 50 meters breaststroke, a chap called Cameron van den Berg, he said to me he could not have set the world record without this diet. He said, why? Because he had such gut distress, because he's got mild celiac disease, that as soon as he cut the grains, he was able to train much harder as a consequence. So it wasn't the glycogen necessary for the exercise, and it's an explosive event. He didn't worry about that. It was being able to train hard each day, and it's a point we forget. 3, immune function and injury risk, and that's a huge, huge factor that is going to come out in the future. And I think Steve's group is, again, emphasizing that we don't know what the effects of this diet is on immune function, but it's likely to be beneficial. And hand-eye coordination or capacity to concentrate in sports like golf and cricket. And I have absolutely no doubt that your performance in those sports will be much improved if you stop getting these glucose insulin spikes. And I'll show you a couple of examples. So it's clearly premature to conclude that all athletes in all sports must be eating high-carbohydrate diets. But now let's get on to the next question, and that's the long-term negative health consequences of high-carbohydrate diets in persons with insulin resistance. And that's never really been focused on, and I'm a classic example, and I would suggest to you that Sir Stephen Redgrave is another example, guy who wins 5 Olympic gold medals and gets type 2 diabetes. And you have to ask, how can you be the world's greatest rower of all time, and you get type 2 diabetes? Was it because he wasn't exercising? So I would guess he's insulin resistant. I'd guess he's got a family history like I do, and the high carbohydrate diet. So you've seen this slide from both myself and Steve. And so my point is that if you're out here, you can eat all those carbs, you'll be fine. But if you're down here, you're going to pay a price. So you might have performance, but you're going to pay a price in the long term. And so I'm going to finish up now with some of my... Here's Bruce Fordyce, who's won 9 Comrades marathons and who's considered the great athlete in South Africa. But 20 years later, he doesn't look so great. This guy's got the metabolic syndrome, and he doesn't mind me mentioning he's a great friend of mine. And he's been rude about me. He said, Tim, you've got a great brain, but you've got a bronze medal body. So I'm going to say... So here he is. He's obese. His legs are awful. And he's got the humpback, etc., etc. And his running is awful, and he hates his running. He goes on the diet, and that's what he looks like now. He's now running 18 minutes for 5Ks at altitude in South Africa at the age of 56. And he dropped his times in the race he had won by 2 hours. He's not anywhere near what he used to run, but the change has been utterly dramatic. And he says thank you every day for this diet, because it recovered his running beautifully. Here's a sort of miracle example. This guy is not a well-known South African runner, but he's a typical South African runner. He was really good as a high school runner. he gets progressively fatter and heavier, and he's running a 56k race. He's still got 30k's to run, and he's got the survival shuffle. His feet are hardly moving. And here he finishes the race in 6 hours 57. That's 1 minute or 2 minutes short of the cutoff, and he's just about last position, 7,668. So he comes and speaks to me, and I said, Simon, you're metabolic, you're insulin resistant, you've got to cut the carbs. He says, I can't cut the carbs. I need it for my energy when I'm running. How can I run? So eventually he says, I'm going to have to cut beer. So I said, yes, for 100 days. So he says, okay, for 100 days I can cope. And so he cuts for 100 days, and he starts to lose weight, and he can run more and more and more and more, and trains harder and harder and harder. So the next picture is 1 year later. And you might guess, if a guy runs 6 hours 57 for a 56-kilometer race, what's he going to do a year later? Well, this is a year later, and he cut his time by 3 hours. Cut it by 3 hours. And he's in 207,400 positions. He is now winning races in South Africa at the age of 37. Astonishing. So what's the point? The point is that it was the insulin resistance and the high carbohydrate diet that was holding him back. So my prediction is if we actually looked at the real world population, runners like him, and we put them on a high-fat diet, we would have such effects on performance that you wouldn't even begin to notice. So now let's go to another group of insulin-resistant athletes. So I know you've probably seen Serial Killers and you've heard Peter speak, and I'm very proud. This is my favorite cricket team, and from a South African. Yeah. And so anyway, it was because of me that they changed their diet, and Peter Bruckner will tell you how it happened. But anyway, we got 4 of your guys to change their diets, and in 2 test matches, 3 of these guys each scored a century in those games. And this occurred, of course, between the Ashes tours. So the Ashes in England was a disaster. They converted their diet, and then, of course, when the Ashes were played here, there was a 5-0 whitewash. And these guys were amazing. So when they were in Cape Town recently, they said, we must have the real meal revolution. So I went to them and I signed about 10 of the books for their family, and it was just a wonderful... Mitch Johnson, who that day destroyed our cricket team, was the most gentlemanly guy I've ever met in my life. And he's completely different than what you see on the field. So anyway, and there's David Warner. And I didn't know David when he was 5 years ago or so, but apparently he was pretty chubby. But here he is scoring 100, and there's no evidence for metabolic syndrome in this man. He's looking amazing. And what did he say on Serial Killers? I've increased my energy to help my recovery. I'm not out of breath when I run between wickets when batting in cricket, which is astonishing. So here's a guy on a low-carb diet who now finds he's got more energy. And then this was my particular favorite, Shane Watson, who's just the most wonderful, wonderful gentleman. If you want a quality person, this is the guy. And he said he was unable to control his weight using conventional dietary methods. He said, I'd always struggled to control my weight. I had to starve at the start of the season. And he said, but by the end of the season, I'd broken down and I just put on the weight again. And he said, I was convinced I was going to be fat all my life. Yeah. And what's he got? Exactly as me. His father's got type 2 diabetes. And he said weight control is effortless on a high-fat diet. And he starts with eggs and so on every day. So why is Shane Warne so happy? Or Shane Watson. I get it too mixed up. Oops. Yeah, Shane Warne was a fabulous cricketer. Geez, what a cricketer, but we used to hate him. So why is he so happy? Because now he can control his weight. You see, that's what he's saying. So the story is, this is what I believe now. I think insulin-sensitive athletes actually do have an advantage, and I think they're selected. So the world's best athletes probably have to be insulin-sensitive, and you probably do have to eat a high-carbohydrate diet to produce explosive activity, let's say lasting 30 minutes. Up to 30 minutes, probably carbohydrates do help you, and the more you can burn, probably the better. So I don't contest that there's a population that will do very well on a high carbohydrate diet. But insulin-resistant athletes with or without type 2 diabetes are unable adequately to suppress hepatic glucose production, causing hyperglycemia. We discussed that before in the earlier talk. And they then convert the excess carbohydrate to triglycerides, producing an unfavorable metabolic state. And that is apparent because they can't control their weight. And then we have to understand what effect is this having on their performance. And I suspect from what I've shown you that there's a big effect on their performance. But they do have the capacity to adapt to high-fat diets without any impairment in exercise performance. And I would argue the more insulin-resistant you are, the better you will adapt to and the more benefits you will get. And, this was for another population, but your exercising diabetic patients or any of your insulin-resistant patients will benefit from carbohydrate restriction and fat adaptation. Thank you very much for your attention.